We're in Paulsbo, Washington. This is an aerial view of our office. We're on Central Valley Road, and there you can see that we actually have a couple of tunnels ourselves. And so we're going to be talking about the tunnels here in a little bit. We have a couple of farmers in our community that have them as well. Brian Stahl, who's joining us, who is also on staff at the district, but is a farmer in on Bainbridge Island, has installed a high tunnel on an equipped contract. And so he's going to be talking a little bit about navigating that process. And so briefly, part of the funding for this webinar is coming through a grant from the National Association of Conservation Districts. And so they work with NRCS and local conservation districts to provide funding to provide farmers, both urban growers as well as larger acreage growers, with technical assistance, connecting them with the kinds of programs and resources that are going to allow them to be successful, conserve resources, and hopefully make their operations more viable. We would really like to thank Sean McDonagh from the Bremerton NRCS office. He serves Kitsap and Mason counties and is our local point of contact. We're also excited because we have Rebecca Anderson, who is now, are you the whole state or just Western Washington, Rebecca?
I cover the whole state.
Okay, so Rebecca Anderson is the urban agriculture specialist with NRCS. She's based in Olympia, and through the magic of technology, we're all here with you. We also have Claire Menard from WSU. We're grateful for WSU Kitsap County Extension for hosting the webinar today and partnering with us. And then they are going to be hosting it in their online learning library as well, so that we have access, so that other people have access to it. And if you want to go back and reference the material from today. And then we have Brian Stahl, who is a conservation resource planner at the district with us as well. So just briefly, if you could take a minute and drop your information in the chat, let us know a little bit about what you're hoping to get from the webinar today. And provide if there'll be any questions that you might have while the presentation is going on. You can drop them in the chat. Claire will be monitoring the chat. I can't see it at this point because I'm in presentation mode, but once Rebecca shares her screen and I'm no longer sharing, we'll be able to we'll take turns monitoring the chat. So really the whole point of the grant is to just increase the number of folks in Kitsap and Mason and even Jefferson and Clallam who are wanting to have these practices on their farms to increase their productivity, to provide them with increased efficiencies, whatever that looks like. And so that is the goal of this grant, and to increase in participation in NRCS programs. They have some really great resources, and we want to get people connected with them because they are a really great way for you to leverage the types of program enhancements that like low tunnels, high tunnels, just a wide range. And Rebecca's going to talk about all of those. And then if there are any new and beginning farmers or anybody who's historically underserved, we just really want to get them connected with conservation through their outreach and some technical assistance. And so these are the goals of our grant. We are funded and are going to be going on this funding source and really working hard at this through July of next year, not July 2025, but July 2026. So that that tells you how long we're going to be working on this, just really to get people connected. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing now, and I'm going to turn the time over to Rebecca, and she and Sean are going to kind of tag team through the program, NRCS programming, and we'll let Rebecca share her screen.
Awesome. Thanks, Diane. Let me get sharing this one. Okay. All right. Can everybody see my screen?
Yep.
Looks
Awesome.
great.
All right. Well, we're going to be chatting a little bit about the urban and small scale agriculture types of assistance that, USDA, NRCS can offer to farmers, ranchers, backyard gardeners, producers, just about anybody out there. Um, just an introduction since I'm not local for, Kitsap up there. My name is Rebecca Anderson Belanca, and I'm the Washington Small Farms and Urban Agriculture Specialist for the state based out of Olympia, like Diane mentioned earlier. And Sean is your lovely local planner. So holler at him for all of your uh, resource conservation, agricultural needs up there. Who is NRCS? So I always kind of like to start out with this just because, in the world of the government, it's sometimes an alphabet soup, right? And so just to kind of break it down a little bit, the Natural Resources Conservation Service is a sub-agency under USDA. And so we were established in 1935 as the Soil Conservation Service. And so you might have heard that. If you're talking to, an old farmer down the road and they're like, oh yeah, the Conservation Service helped us with this back in the 60s or whatever it is, right? And our agency was created in response to some farming practices that really eventually ended up resulting in the Dust Bowl. And so we provide technical and financial assistance to landowners or people leasing land. So that's an important part, people leasing land. And so what is technical and financial assistance? These sound like government mumbo jumbo, and they kind of are. So technical assistance is basically where, Sean as the local planner or me as the specialist come in and we make a visit out to someone's farm, someone's property, and we might make some recommendations on solutions to some concerns that they might be having out there. Financial assistance is where sometimes we can look at turning some of these solutions or some of these recommendations into applications for financial reimbursement through some of our federal programs that are generally funded through the Farm Bill and in some years the Inflation Reduction Act. We are non-regulatory, which means that we can't make you do anything you don't want to do on your land, and enrollment in our programs is fully voluntary. And so basically we just work with folks to benefit the soil, water, air, plants, animals, and basically increase conservation on private lands. So who do we help? We help everyone. And I always like to make a big point of that because I am a urban and small farm specialist. And so we don't just work with, folks in Eastern Washington farming thousands of acres. We work with everybody. So we provide technical assistance, right? Making site visits to folks' properties for farmers, ranchers, backyard gardeners, entities like LLCs, nonprofits, tribes, just about anybody you could think of, right? And you don't have to be what we classically think of as a farmer in order to request assistance from us. Really, we're just out helping folks who are interested in conservation. And so there's no minimum or maximum size for properties that you're looking for assistance on. And so, if you have, backyard containers growing tomatoes, right? You can still request assistance from us. And the person requesting assistance can be either a landowner or a tenant on a piece of ground. And so we always like to emphasize that because land access is, it's a difficult topic, right? And so especially in our more urban and suburban areas, land can be quite expensive. So a lot of people do lease land. And you don't have to sell a product or, have a business plan in order to request assistance from us. And also, assistance is free. We do get that question sometimes, right? Like, how much does it cost to have y'all come out and make a site visit, make recommendations? Your tax dollars pay our salaries, so thank you. Um, all right, so up on screen are a couple of definitions here. What would a presentation be without definitions? And I do want to stress these are USDA definitions, not necessarily NRCS. And so I'll go into that a little bit more in a minute here. So USDA defines urban agriculture as, cultivating, processing, and distributing agricultural products in urban and suburban areas. Super broad definition, right? And it's all about like where you're located. And then USDA defines a small farm as an operation with gross cash farm income under $250,000 annually. This is also a super broad definition, and it's really looking at financials rather than where you're at in the state, right? And so most farms in the US are considered small, um, but large farms, right, who make more than $250,000 annually account for 85% of the market. And so, we can see we have a huge number of small scale farms, right? And these farmers are producing agricultural products. And so, like, our goal at NRCS is to support small scale producers just the same as we do our large scale producers, right? And so that's kind of how my position came to be, right? Because, there's slightly different needs, management strategies, and goals of small scale operations. They're just, a little bit different than our larger scale operations. And so, these definitions are from USDA, not NRCS. But I really wanted to show them because the interpretation is so broad, and I actually think that's a really good thing because it's a lot more inclusive of our different types of growers around the state. So when we're talking about urban agriculture, I did just want to pop this up here and show, like, according to census data, this is how, like, we at NRCS define our urban area. And so on the left here, we can see this is just a census data map essentially, showing urban areas. And then we at NRCS just put a 2-mile buffer on it. And so we can see pretty much all of our Puget Sound area here is urban, right? And so we do have some outlying areas here, but even if you're not in a, like, quote unquote urban area, like, small scale farmers are dealing with a lot of the same challenges, and they have a lot of the same, like, goals as the urban folks. And so that's kind of how I look at things, right? It's like the intensity of management, the scale, all of it, right? And so, yeah. Okay. So there are a lot of words up on screen here. And so these are some of our more common practices that we see on small scale farms. And I'm just going to read through them really quick, and then we'll go into a little bit more detail on a couple more of these in a few slides here. And so for cropland, a lot of times we talk about high tunnel systems, which is where a lot of our folks come in and start working with us, is by requesting a high tunnel. Conservation cover, which is generally looking at some kind of pollinator planting. Crop rotation, soil carbon amendment, which is talking about compost and biochar. Cover crops, wildlife habitat plantings and hedgerow plantings a lot of times are basically hedgerow plantings, right? Woody types of plantings as a buffer. Irrigation pipeline and micro irrigation, mulching, raised beds, and low tunnel systems. On grazing lands, a lot of times we'll talk about waste storage facilities, brush management, herbaceous weed treatment, right? So it's either removing woody species for the brush management or herbaceous species for the herbaceous weed treatment. Roofs and covers, fencing, prescribed grazing, roof runoff structures, heavy use area protections, nutrient management, watering facilities. And we do have a new practice, which has a ridiculously long name. It's non-ruminant livestock outdoor management of vegetative cover, which is basically just grazing systems for non-ruminants like poultry, hogs, those sorts of things. For wildlife practices, a lot of times we'll look at upland wildlife habitat management, which is more on the management seeding side to increase habitat for wildlife, and then structures for wildlife, so thinking bird boxes, bat boxes, that type of thing. And then we also do have a practice for organic management, which is looking at organic transition assistance. Okay, high tunnel systems. So basically, sorry, the lights just went off in here. Let me wave my arms really quick. Sorry about that. More technical difficulties. Um, the requirements for high tunnel systems generally, I just like to go over these just so folks have kind of a rundown on what we're talking about. as a high tunnel system because there's a couple different names for the same thing, right? You might hear folks call these field houses, cold frames, high tunnels, whatever it might be, right? And so generally for NRCS high tunnels, these are going to be from a manufactured kit, right? And so there's a whole slew of high tunnel kit companies out there, and we generally just ask that folks send us a kit that they're looking at, and we'll make sure that it meets, your needs as a grower and also your site conditions. If you're in an area that might get a lot of wind, a lot of snow, we might recommend that you kind of like beef up the tunnel that you're looking at just so you get some more like structural stability out there. The frame can be made from metal, wood, or durable plastic, and the height at the center point needs to be at least 6 feet. End walls, what we're looking at in this picture is kind of a pretty fancy type of end wall, honestly. But so it says as needed up here because, you know, in some of our warmer seasons or in some of our warmer states, end walls are not always needed. But in general, in Washington, our limiting factor is cold, especially if we're trying to grow into the shoulder seasons or maybe through the winter. And so we do generally recommend that folks look at end walls. And crops are meant to be grown in the natural soil profile or in raised beds up to 12 inches. But in cases where folks might be mobility limited, applicants can put in an email request to be able to use raised beds that are up to 4 feet tall. So, folks can farm from standing, from wheelchairs, from any position they need to, really. And for the first 5 years that the tunnel is up, they're only supposed to be used for growing crops, not for storage, not for livestock, or for seeds starting on trays. And I just have a bunch of pictures because I am a fan of pictures. And so we're just going to roll through a couple slides with pictures of different high tunnels up here. And so we can see up here on the left, this is a round or Quonset type of tunnel. And on the right, this is a Gothic or peak type of tunnel. And both are perfectly applicable for NRCS to look at and assist with through funding. I'm super happy for people to interrupt me with questions, with comments, with whatever. So. And I will say, like, on this, we do see that this is a little bit bigger of a high tunnel, right? And it has a little bit more structural stability built into this, right? And so this is a little bit more of a wind-prone area. And so this is what, we as planners and then also the grower came to agreement on as it would probably work best for their site. And we can also see the roll-up sides here and that the ends are rolled up as well. Okay, so
Rebecca, we have a question.
yeah.
Someone asks, who produces those Gothic style tunnels pictured?
So we can't officially recommend any high tunnel company over another. I do believe this one in particular was Oregon Valley Greenhouses, but again, we're not recommending one company or over another. So.
All right, thanks.
Okay, rolling into low tunnel systems. Low tunnels are really pretty similar to high tunnels, right? The purpose is to extend the growing season, protect from frost, protect from wind, protect from, heavy rains that might be damaging the quantity or the quality of the crops out in a farm, right? And these are different from high tunnels in that they can either be from a manufactured kit or they can be built DIY. Right. And so if they're from a kit similar to high tunnels, we just ask that folks find a kit that they're interested in and send it to us to make sure that it meets all of the requirements. If folks are interested in building them DIY, we ask that the frame be made from a prefabricated metal, minimum 10 gauge wire, electrical conduit or PVC, and the height at the center of these needs to be 4 feet or shorter. We do not cover anything in the 4 foot to 6 foot range, and I have no idea why, but that's just the way it is, apparently. So these ones are 4 feet or shorter, and high tunnels are 6 feet or taller. The cover is supposed to be of a significant thickness for the purpose of, season extension. So, this might be frost blanket or plastic at the beginning of the season to help out with those transitional periods as we move into the more full growing season, right? Protect from spring frost, that kind of thing. Uh, and then folks might be shifting this over to something like a shade cloth, right, during the summer in order to protect some of our more sensitive crops. And these low tunnels can be used inside a high tunnel as well. And folks might do this to get a couple of extra layers of protection, for example, on cold nights within that high tunnel. Or they might be growing a few different crops in their high tunnel, right? And so they might need different kinds of protection at different times of the year, if that makes sense. And, I really like low tunnels because they're super flexible to meet the grower's needs, especially when folks are growing diverse crops out on their farms. Here is a picture of some prefabricated hoops. And we can see this clasp right here is how the cover is secured on them. Here are some pictures of wire, and this is a heavy insect netting on these tunnels over here, and we can see that they are anchored with sandbags. And so we can see that these are over little baby seedlings as well, right? So we're giving them that extra bump that they need at the beginning of the season. And we can see similarly, these are also wire with, this looks like an insect netting on them as well. But, these are probably more for pest protection at this point. And a lot of times we do recommend that folks get them high enough to get them up over that vegetation, just so that there's not a transition point for little bugs to be able to get through, basically. And, we can roll on to some of our next practices. Cover crop is basically planting an alternative crop, normally during a season when you're not growing something else. So a lot of times folks around here will plant a cover crop in winter, right, in order to help out with weed suppression, organic matter, compaction, and erosion. And these can either be single species or multi-species mixes. Crop rotation is where we work with the farmer to design a crop plan that rotates crop families or different kinds of crop root structures, right? But I would say more often than not, folks do use this in order to break pest and disease cycles, right? By rotating crop families. And so we always get questions, especially on small scale diverse farms, this is a plan, but what happens, when I need to switch out a bed of carrots for a bed of lettuce, right? So for us, like we look at a crop rotation plan as just that, right? It's a plan. We know that things are going to happen. We just ask that, as these things happen, you keep us updated. And so, yeah, and so really the point is to keep the records of your crop rotation through the year and see how that affects your yields and your different kinds of, pest pressures or anything else out there through the year. And so really for crop rotation, we're incentivizing you to keep the records and be able to look back and have that evaluation at the end of the year and see if you might want to do things differently the next year. All the practices up here are basically looking at increasing habitat for wildlife and pollinators. And so conservation cover is normally planting herbaceous pollinator species. And then hedgerows and wildlife habitat planting are used to plant both woody and herbaceous species. And so, I say that they're generally used for wildlife and pollinator habitat, but they can also be used to reduce particulate matter, chemical drift, and odors coming onto or off of a site. And they can also be used as a screen for noise and dust, and also, of course, to increase carbon sequestration in the soil. And I like to, talk about incorporating these on small farms to also act as a wind barrier, right? Because in some of our areas, we do get some pretty significant wind damage on our crops. And so kind of having a little bit of a buffer there really helps out with the quality and the quantity that we're getting off of our fields. Mulching and micro irrigation. So, mulching can be used for a lot of different reasons, right? A lot of times we do see it in support of some of our pollinator plantings, but we can also just see it, through the form of organic materials like straw, like leaves, like wood chips, or like deep compost mulch on our beds in order to decrease the weed competition or to improve our moisture management a little bit better, things like that. And then we also see folks use inorganic materials like geotextile or plastic for the same purposes. And micro irrigation, we normally look at this as an improvement to the system, right? So we do require that folks have what's called an irrigation history out on their properties, which is 2 of the last 5 years have been irrigated out there. And then we look at, improving the efficiency of your irrigation system, right? So going from something like a sprinkler to something like micro irrigation. Small scale grazing practices. So, all the we do help out a lot of grazing systems on a small scale, right? And so, and I actually really, really like working with small scale grazing producers. I think the more intense management is actually really, um, it's a lot more interesting to help design rather than large scale, right? Where you're just putting animals out in Eastern Washington for, 6 months, right? Um, and so all of the infrastructure practices that we might talk about for grazing systems are really built to facilitate a grazing plan, right? Which is really just managed grazing where you're moving your animals depending on how your forage is looking out there. And so we help out with things like cross fencing, which can be barbed wire, net wire, high tensile or electric fence or temporary electric fence. And it really allows for more adaptive management of the forages out on somebody's site in order to move your animals, depending on, if we have a very long, wet winter, for example. But really encouraging folks to move their animals in order to maintain their natural resources out there. And livestock water systems, these are installed also to help facilitate rotational grazing. Because when we split out a bigger pasture into smaller paddocks, we're going to need to somehow get water to those animals. Sometimes we look at forage plantings. And so this can be if a site is really, really degraded, or if somebody just, let's say removed a whole bunch of blackberry and suddenly it's bare ground out there. Or sometimes we look at helping folks to incorporate a little bit more diversity into their systems in certain situations, natural dewormers, right? Things like that. And then prescribed grazing, right? This is a managed grazing plan where we take a look at how much forage you can typically produce on your site, how many animals you're running. We try to find the balance there for, a pretty good number of animals for you to have out on your site without having to spend too much money on hay. Soil carbon amendment is where folks use materials like compost and biochar to increase organic matter. And the practice is really similar to some of our other amendment practices, where basically we want to see a soil test and then we want to see the amendment test, whether it's compost or biochar, whether you're buying it in from offsite or whether you're producing it on site. And then we help to create a nutrient budget for you to kind of calculate how much of this amendment that you might need to apply on your land in order to get the change in the soils that are going to benefit your specific crops that you're going to grow out there. Raised beds is another new practice that's broadly applicable, but is also really great for urban sites that are dealing with contamination from previous industrial or agricultural management. These can be framed or unframed, and they're generally supposed to be 6 to 24 inches tall, although again, in some cases for folks with mobility limitations, they can be up to 4 feet tall. And organic management systems. So this is basically a group of different practices that are kind of built together in order to help people to transition to organic certification. And so we look a lot at, what do people have in terms of perennial buffers, and would they maybe want to put in an application for perennial buffers in order to meet the organic management requirements for the organic program. We look at their crop rotation, their cover crops, their nutrient management, their prescribed grazing, and their livestock infrastructure and their livestock nutrient balance, depending on if they are only crop producers, if they're livestock producers, or if they produce both on their farm. And we do also offer all of these practices as standalone practices, but just specifically for this newer practice, I do like to talk about these because, depending on where a grower is selling into for their products, it can either make a lot of sense or it doesn't make any sense in order to transition to organic. So, and then, everyone's super excited about agroforestry right now, so I just wanted to throw this slide in here too, of course. And so, for agroforestry types of practices, we do talk a lot about these. And so, I can go into these more later if people are more interested, but we talk a lot about alley cropping, forest farming, windbreaks, silvopasture, right, where you're managing both the forage underneath and the trees above, riparian forest buffers, hedgerows, and tree establishment. And then if we're talking about looking more at planting some of the understory, we might be looking at a conservation cover, wildlife habitat planting, a pasture and hay planting, or a range planting. And then, for these mixed forage or crop with higher woody systems, right? Because we're always going to have the underlayer of our agroforestry system and the upper layer of our agroforestry system. There needs to be some kind of management in there in order to keep your system where you want it to be. And so we might also be talking about management practices like prescribed grazing or crop rotation. Okay, Sean, I believe this is where you are taking off.
Oh, that's true. Thank you, Becca. Hey, everybody. So now I'll be switching focus to going over more in detail about the NRCS programs themselves, as well as the application process. So starting with NRCS programs, we have two primary programs that provide financial assistance to producers. The first is our Environmental Quality Incentives Program, known as EQIP for short. Now, EQIP is often the program most folks become involved with their first time working with NRCS. And the reason for this is because the program is a great starter program to treat resource concerns on a property through implementing conservation practices like the ones that Becca explained earlier. For the payments done through EQIP, they're done on the reimbursement model and everything. So this is where the client will install the practice based on specifications provided by NRCS, and afterwards NRCS will come out to certify the installation and then make the payment. Now, even though I do say it is a reimbursement model, that does not mean the payment will be
Sean, you went mute for some reason. Nope, you're still muted, but your video is back.
cover additional as well.
Okay, now you're back, Sean.
Along with this, we have the contract length. So for EQIP contracts, they're often 1 to 3 years, depending on how many conservation practices we have scheduled within a contract. So for something like a high tunnel contract, this would often just be a 1-year contract versus something like a planting project, kind of like with the hedgerow or habitat planting that Becca had shown off. This might be something like a 3-year contract where we have the first year be where we do the site prep and the planting, and then the following years we have a couple of years of post-plant weed control to make sure that the planting has its best chance to succeed. Our other main program is our Conservation Stewardship Program, or CSP for short. CSP is a fairly different program from EQIP. For starters, it's more suited for folks who've already established a management system on their property, versus with EQIP, you can sometimes jump right into it right after getting a property, depending on the kind of practices that you're looking to do. Um, Along with this, CSP does have some caveats regarding eligibility for the program. I haven't jumped on eligibility just yet, but we'll go into that in more detail here later. Um, for CSP, though, two main eligibility requirements that are pretty different than with EQIP. The first one is needing to meet our stewardship threshold eligibility requirement. And so this is where in our system, we need to show that you're already meeting 2 resource concern categories on every land use for all the properties in your operation and everything. And so this can be cropland, pasture, range, forest land, farmstead, or associated ag land. And for the resource concern categories, these can be things such as soil health, terrestrial habitat, or water quality. Each land use will have a set list of resource concern categories that we need to assess, versus with EQIP, where we're trying to specifically target resource concerns piece by piece. The other main eligibility requirement that comes up in CSP, which is related just to cropland for our current farm bill, requires that cropland to have been in production for the 6 years immediately prior to December 31st of 2018. So if you have cropland that you just started in 2020 or later and everything, that land wouldn't be eligible for CSP right now. But once we get a new farm bill, they'll most likely end up updating the years and everything, so you might become eligible at that point. Some other differences for the CSP program is that instead of just doing base practices like we do through EQIP, we can also do enhancements, which are more robust versions of our practices that are more to improve upon good conservation work that has already taken place, instead of trying to just treat resource concerns on the property like we would do through EQIP. Another large difference is the way the payments are done through the programs. For CSP, it's still a reimbursement model, but instead of being paid out right after installing a practice or enhancement, you're paid annually in the fall, and this payment will also include a base annual payment as well. And then the last big difference would be for CSP contracts, they go for a total of 5 years and everything, regardless of if we have something scheduled every year for 5 years, or we just have something scheduled for 1 year and everything. And then even on the years that you're not installing a practice or enhancement, you'd still get your base annual payment. And at a minimum, every year of your contract, you'd be getting $4,000. And can we go to the next slide, Becca? So now that we've kind of talked about the 2 individual programs in a bit of detail, I wanted to jump into kind of the process of going through our programs from application to getting to contract and everything. So the first step is to reach out to your local NRCS planner. So for folks in Kitsap and Mason, that'd be me. I know someone was asking about Jefferson, and that's Aaron. For folks that are in King County, there's John Larson. For folks in Pierce County, there's Aaron Gutierrez. For anyone here that might be in Thurston or have land in Thurston, we have Deshelle Burnham, we have Tara Donahoe, and we have Alex Wyatt and everything down there. So once you've reached out to your local NRCS planner, they'll get you set up with some paperwork and everything. This will be including a CPA 1200, which is the name of our NRCS program application form and everything. It's just a 3-page form that you fill out, and then you'll also get set up with an eligibility packet, which will be the bulk of the paperwork that you'll do the first time around. And a lot of these forms are just so you can get your eligibility for USDA programs set up with the Farm Service Agency. And so when you have those, if you have any questions, you can feel free to reach out to both your planner and as well to the FSA staff as well, because sometimes they'll both have different knowledge points for the forms and everything. So there are no restrictions, though, for if you want to sign up as an individual or as an entity and everything. There's only a few differences regarding kind of like forms to get set up, as well as kind of like how some of the forms are signed and everything. So for And then as Becca kind of talked about landowner versus tenant, if you're leasing ground, you can still completely enroll into NRCS programs. And generally, if you are leasing, it's just a few other forms as well. Mainly it's getting a copy of your lease to the Farm Service Agency showing that you are the leasee for that land as well for when they get you set up in their system. And then for us, we have a form where if you're doing an installation for a practice for something that's going to have more than a 1 year lifespan. So that'd be something like if you're putting out a high tunnel, we have the landowner sign this form saying they're okay with the high tunnel being installed on their property. But if you were doing something kind of like a cover crop, which is just kind of a 1 year practice and everything like that, you wouldn't need the landowner to sign off on a practice like that. And then jumping back to eligibility and everything. So there are a few main eligibility components to consider. The first one is our adjusted gross income eligibility requirement, and that requires that you're making a gross income of under $900,000, and this would be an average over your last 3 tax seasons. And so for an entity and everything, all the members within that entity also need to be making under $900,000. If any members make over that, then any payments that the entity would get through a contract would be reduced based on the shares of that member within the entity. Another big eligibility requirement is being compliant with the 1985 Farm Bill for wetland compliance and highly erodible land compliance. And this is mainly pertaining to making sure neither yourself or a previous landowner has like drained a wetland post 1985 to be able to grow commodity crops. And then if you're doing any tillage activities on the property, that your tillage rate isn't eroding the soil beyond kind of historic acceptable levels. So at the same time that you're kind of filling out the application form and this eligibility packet for the Farm Service Agency, you can also schedule a visit with your NRCS planner to come out to the property to discuss your goals as well as any concerns you've already noted while you've been on the property yourself and everything. Your planner, while they're out there, will gather some basic inventory information, both about your operation, getting some baseline data about like the condition of your soils and everything, and kind of livestock and production, things of that nature, depending on what your operation entails. And then kind of talk with you about potential practices or enhancements that would be a good fit to treat those resource concerns that match with both what you want to see done on the property as well as that also would make sense both for labor restrictions and things of that nature. Now there's also a deadline for getting your application into NRCS, and this is often in October of each year as noted kind of here. So for this year that'd be October of 2025, and so this is what the reason we do this is so that we can batch applications together for the year and everything to work on them throughout the coming year. There is also an eligibility deadline for the FSA paperwork as well. Now, this is usually later past the deadline to get the application form itself in. For this last year, it was in the January following the application deadline. So for October 2025 application deadline, we'd be looking probably around January of 26 being the eligibility deadline. But it's always good to get the FSA forms in sooner, just in case things might go awry and stuff, and there might be something where they run into an issue in their system. So having it in there sooner is always beneficial. So once you and your NRCS planner have decided on a list of conservation practices or enhancements to do for your application for that year, your planner will then take your application and rank it into fund pools that it's eligible for. And this is generally done in either late January or early February. And then after the application is ranked, this is where it's going to compete against other applications within those fund pools. And then generally throughout spring and everything, our state office will make selections for applications for pre-approval and everything. And this can start as late or as early as kind of like late February and everything. And then sometimes because we'll have funding kind of come in throughout the year and stuff, we can have folks get pre-approved late into the summer and sometimes even as late as August in some situations. Now, if your application is selected for pre-approval, your planner will notify you about this and ask if you still wish to move forward with your application, because sometimes things do change. And if you do decide to move forward, then your planner will begin to assemble your contract documents. This will include the specifications for the practices and enhancements that both you and your planner decided to have in the application. And then usually at this point, when they're letting you know about the pre-approval, this will also be when they provide you with the direct deposit form to fill out, as all payments through NRCS are done through direct deposit and everything. Now, once your planner has all the contract forms assembled, they'll reach out to you again to meet up with you to have everything signed. And then once everything's signed, they submit it to their area office. So in this case, our area office is down in Olympia. And then our area office will do one final review, making sure that there's nothing sideways or anything like that. Nothing was missed. And then if no issues pop up and everything, then the application will be obligated into a full contract. Once it's obligated, your planner will again reach out to you to notify you to let you know about this. And then generally at this stage, you can start talking about beginning implementation and everything for the practices, depending on when they were kind of scheduled out and everything. One caveat to bring up, though, is even after your contract is obligated, all applications have to go through a cultural review process. So for the majority of these, it's a pretty quick turnaround and stuff where our cultural specialist just reviews the project and everything. But for projects where there's going to be ground disturbing activities, such as putting in irrigation pipeline, livestock pipeline, fencing, and things like that, sometimes they need to take a little longer to review it. And sometimes especially for pipeline projects and everything, they'll sometimes schedule a time to come out to do a survey and everything to make sure that where the project is planned isn't going to hit anything, hit any cultural artifacts that might be down there or anything of that nature. And so once they're done with their process and everything, they email the planner and give them the cultural clearance information. And then once we have that cultural clearance, the planner reaches out and provides you that documentation for your records and everything. And then at that point, you're good to begin installing and implementing and everything as you see fit. And then, although prior to getting the cultural clearance, if you are obligated, you can purchase materials and everything if you do have a safe place to store them and everything. We do caution folks against doing that often, because we don't want you to purchase materials and have them sit somewhere for a couple of months while the survey or the review process is going on. And then by the time you're able to install them, sometimes the materials might degrade if they weren't able to be stored in a safe, secure location and things like that. And so that's the end of my portion of the presentation. So I'll pass it back over to Becca.
Thanks, Sean. I swear the presentation is almost done. I did just want to put a plug in here. I sent around a survey probably starting a month or two ago that was basically just like asking questions about what folks' needs were and what their priorities were on urban and small scale farms. Because, you know, we at NRCS, right, we talk to people in the field who are growing all the time, but, we can't possibly know everything that everyone is needing out there. And so it's anonymous. And so I'll put the link in here in the chat, when I'm done sharing. But, I just really want to encourage folks to give some feedback because this is how we decide, what kinds of practices do get prioritization for funding, if we need to be looking at creating new practice scenarios, which is, how we kind of got to having about 10 different selections for high tunnels at this point, right? Whether you have a Gothic high tunnel, whether it's a Quonset, whether it's smaller than 600 square feet, right? All these different things out there. Those all came from producer feedback. So just a plug. And then, yeah, just the same thing. Like we always want to hear what people's needs are out there because, all the different agencies that are represented here today, right? We all have our things we can do and things we can't do, right? In our different ways, whether it's through funding sources, whether it's through, how much is required for these different practices, documentation, like all these different things, right? And so, but I just, you know, in order to keep up with the new technologies that are available, like, right, this is how low tunnels came to be, right? We heard that need from folks out in the field. And so that new practice was just created, right? And so I just want to encourage folks, give feedback, talk to us. We're pretty friendly. Here's my contact information. And I'm also actually going to put our service center locator link in the chat as well when I'm done sharing. And it's where you can route to your state and then your county, and it gives you all the contact information for your NRCS office, your Farm Service Agency office. And so, you kind of have like a name and a phone number that you can holler at, which is a little bit easier than like the whole the agency, right? So, sorry.
So
Yes.
Rebecca, do you also have the link for your survey to drop into the chat so that
Mhm.
people can find it? And we can also push that out to our lists because um, it's really great to get feedback.
Yeah. And that would be super awesome. I appreciate it, Diane, and I will for sure drop it in the chat here.
Okay, so Rebecca, there is one question. Well, there was, okay, so the first question, and you did respond to it while Sean was talking. It's about suppliers of the greenhouse, and you point out that it is really a great idea. A lot of websites say meets NRCS specs for equipped high tunnels, but you have to verify before you order, before you spend any money, verify with your NRCS planner that it does meet the requirements for a given area. Because if you're buying one from Farmer Friend back in the Midwest, it may not necessarily be suitable for the snow load out here. So that's a really great information. But a quick Google search takes you to like a whole bunch of sponsored apps, sponsored sites. So it really shouldn't be too hard to find somebody online.
Yeah, and in addition to that, I'll also say like, for high tunnels and low tunnels, right? For a lot of our small scale like farming businesses, right? Like they've basically like made it their whole business, right? In producing these products for folks who are seeking funding through NRCS. And so they have like spec sheets that basically say, hand this to your NRCS representative and you'll be good to go. And so, whether you hand that to, Sean, if you're interested in that specific kit, or whether you send him the link to the specific kit that you're looking at, that really helps us because, for example, last year there were a few issues with a pretty popular vendor, and our requirement on the poly covering, the 6 mil poly covering for high tunnels, is that it has a 4-year lifespan. And so they had on their website a couple different numbers. They had both 4 years and 3 years. When I reached out to the company, they th said it was 3 years. And so we could not reimburse on that company. And then as it turns out, they found out that that was happening and they suddenly changed the wording on their website. So,
Oh,
um,
that's a
but
little sketch.
it's a little sketch, but it's just an example of like, we do look at these things, right? And so we go through and we make sure that we're hitting all the requirements that are laid out in our standards and specifications. And so, just to like keep things like super streamlined for everybody, right? Like we don't want to put our producers in a bind by, putting down some money on a high tunnel kit that may not meet our requirements. And so, we've had people send us Amazon links or Alibaba links. We've had people send us links to like just about every high tunnel company out there, right? And so we just go through and we check them all just to make sure that it's going to do what you need it to do. And these kinds of info sheets do for sure exist for the low tunnels as well. So again, just shoot them over to us.
So there is another question in the chat. This is from Caitlin in Jefferson regarding reimbursement rates because of our recent federal upheaval. And I know she says, I know there are many farmers who've been having trouble getting reimbursed. Is anyone who is working with NRCS had issues with this? And is there any sense of when future funding will land?
Okay, multiple things. So I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Sean, but I think most of the active contracts, I don't believe those got touched. Those were okay. Those are still getting paid out on.
Yeah, we had back in, what was it? The late end of February, we had the IRA funding pause for folks who had contracts through IRA. They
Inflation
had,
Reduction Act.
yep, sorry. I'm so used to just throwing out acronyms. Um, But yeah, for the Inflation Reduction Act folks who got funded, who had contracts through that funding pool instead of just farm bill funding, they had a pause for a couple weeks and stuff. But that did get reversed and everything. So we were able to start paying folks out on those ones. And that's where we're at right now, where there's no payment pauses on anyone with active EQIP or CSP contracts, regardless of their funding source.
Yeah.
So,
And so a lot of the stuff that happened at the federal level, right? It was it basically just needed to get sorted out at the federal level. And so, I won't, because I know there are maybe still some producers out there across the country who may have had like their rural development, Rural Energy for America program grants paused and stuff. And so we can't really speak to the other agencies. There's 29 agencies in USDA. And so unfortunately, we can't be an expert for everybody. And so, we can only really speak to the NRCS stuff because it's really all that we have latitude to keep up on with the federal stuff going on as is. I mean, to be honest.
well, it's good to know that there is still money flowing. Okay, so
Yeah.
Jody wants to know if your amendment compost program is different than the WSDA compost reimbursement.
Mm.
And I would say yes, it is. My question would be, WSDA requires it come from a certified compost producer. Where are you guys at on that?
Mm. So there are multiple different scenarios within composting, right? And so, just like I mentioned, there's like 10 different scenarios for high tunnels, for the different types of high tunnels. That's also true for our soil carbon amendment practice. And so for us, you can do compost that you produce on your own site or compost that you buy in. However, we do require that the amendment get tested for the same constituents, whether it's coming from a outside source or a source on your farm. And so, it's extra cost, right, for the producer to send out their homegrown compost, but that's how we determine if there are any undesirable biological buddies in the compost, if there are any heavy metals or contaminants, or if it's out of balance in some other way that would actually harm your production out there.
Okay, awesome. All right. Any other questions? I think we'll just refer them until after we get done here. The next presenter is Brian, and I need to share my screen again so that I can get to the section of the presentation for him. And so I'm going to turn it over to you, Brian.
That's not a great photo. It looks like I'm upset.
Well, okay, there are a number of photos with
Thank
you
you very
looking
much,
really
Diane.
cheerful, but it's the only one that has you and Penny in it. And I
Well,
want to give her equal billing.
Penny's fine in this one, but I'm surely not. We're actually watching shearing. We're shearing sheep at that point. And I can't tell you what I was thinking at that moment, but
We can
nothing
speculate.
nothing bad happened. Everything went super smooth, but yeah, yeah. Can we move on?
Okay, so briefly, I want to introduce Brian. He and his wife Penny have the Winnie Farm on Bainbridge Island. It's a diversified family farm. They have grass-fed beef. They have pork, pastured poultry. They do fryers as well as chicken, as well as turkeys. They sell eggs there at the local farmers market, and they also have pastured lamb. And so they've got a lot going on. And so I just wanted to introduce you, Brian. He is also a planner at Kitsap. In full disclosure, he's a planner at Kitsap Conservation District in his spare time. So let's go next.
Spare time. That's my full-time job, pay for farming. Um, so I'm not exactly sure what I'm gonna, talk about them. We did get a high tunnel funded on the farm, and it's, in this photo here, it's where there's a black tarp up in front of that, just down the slope of the red house. That's where we ended up putting it. I'm gonna say one thing that you do not want to do Do not change your business name in the middle of a contract. Very bad. That did not go well at all, and that caused all kinds of headaches. But never at the end, I actually did get reimbursed for this high tunnel. And since I'm going to talk as Winnie Farm and not as Kitsap Conservation District at this point, this is an Oregon Valley greenhouse. And I built this. I think this was the sixth one that I built. I built one at our office, and then four other farms throughout the county. I'm not in the business of building these things anymore. I'm just too old. But we everything is beefed up on it. We went with the heavier metal hoops, closer spacing. I don't want to rebuild it, and we did go 2 layers. And for me, the 2 layers of fab or plastic was not for the insulation value. It was for the windage protection, because if you inflate that, then you're not going to get the wind wear that you're going to get if you have a single layer of plastic on there. This thing just doesn't move, and I've seen ones like this. There's ones on the island that they've been up for well over 10 years and have never replaced the plastic. So the program's great. Like I say, do not change your business name. If it wasn't for that, it would have been probably super smooth. I built, I built this myself, like I said earlier. Beefed everything up, and Sean was great. We did go with the polycarbonate end walls just because it was, it's going to look nicer, it's going to last longer. The bigger doors. Um, we did go with, I did put gutters on it. That wasn't funded. But we wanted to catch the water off this high tunnel just for use in the actual high tunnel, and for the area just outside of it for drip irrigation. I'm not sure what else you want me to talk about, Diane. I guess when we do have, I guess I can move on a little bit. Um, we're currently, I believe, under contract for fencing, if I'm not mistaken. We'll discuss that. I guess Sean's coming out on Friday to further discuss that. I would like to do a waste storage facility or heavy use area protection. But that requires a certified nutrient management plan, and I guess I do not want to discuss that because I'm not positive of all the hiccups with that, but I know of plenty hiccups that yeah, and I don't want to get too deep into that. One thing that I guess I do want to mention that because Sean went mute for probably a minute, and I'd be willing to bet that he brought up the fact that you can, and Sean, you can scold me if I'm saying this wrong, you can get an advance payment of a certain percentage for some of these practices, which help offset the initial purchase cost. Um, it helped, I didn't take advantage of it just because my business name changed, so I wasn't able to do it. But that could have helped pay for the upfront costs of the high tunnel.
Yeah, that is correct. You can get, for folks who are historically underserved clients, and I didn't go into that in too much detail, but those are categories of folks who are like beginning farmers, if you've been farming less than 10 years, veteran farmers and ranchers, socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers, and limited resource farmers and ranchers. You can get an advance payment for your contract items of 50% up front. So that way you can purchase materials or pay for labor and everything to help alleviate that initial installation cost. Um, It does come with some caveats, though. After you get the payment, you have 90 days to spend it entirely. If you don't spend all of it, we ask for all of it back. So usually, most folks will do it for things kind of like what Brian was saying, for a high tunnel, or for folks who are doing like engineering practices. Those can be very expensive upfront costs and everything. So that is a really good option for folks who fall into that historically underserved category.
I will also say on that, after you do show that you've spent the funds within the 90 days of receiving the advance payment, it is a little bit closer of a relationship with your planner after that, just because, generally the state office is kind of like, okay, so where are we at on this? We can see that there's been an advance payment done. Are they finished yet? Can we complete this payment? So it's just a few more check-ins than you might see if you didn't go through the advance payment process.
So one of the things too, and Sean didn't really, he might have touched on this when he went mute for us for a minute. As part of the application process, you will be applying for the NRCS, but you'll also be applying for FSA. Brian, you want to talk briefly about what that process was like?
Sorry, you got the answer. I was looking at a message I was gonna start typing, but what was the question again?
How was
I'd focus. I have a hard time focusing.
As part of the application process, you also will be filling out application paperwork for FSA, the Farm Service Agency. And could you talk briefly about how that went?
It's nothing that's terribly difficult. Nothing, none of the whole process is not terribly difficult. But like I said earlier, do not make sure if you have a business name, make sure your business name is exactly how it is on your federal, if you have an EIN number or whatever, make sure that your business name is exact because they look at that very, very closely. And don't change your business. Don't change your business name. But other than that, if if all that stuff is consistent, there's no surprises. It's not, the forms are not difficult to fill out.
I'll also add on to that. You know, FSA forms, a lot of times people are sent a packet that's about 40 pages long with instructions on it. And that can be a little bit overwhelming, especially if you're not used to like working within like the government realm or whatever. And so we really encourage folks to holler at their local farm service agency office and set up a meeting, like whether it's on the phone or in person at the FSA office, in order to have somebody who knows that language tell you what it means, be able to help you through those forms. Because, oh my goodness, if you like, I always call it governmentese. And so, like, you need a translator, right? And so, that can be overwhelming for folks. We encourage folks to reach out early and often to say, hey, what does this mean? We can't tell you how to answer questions, but we can tell you what the questions mean, right? Um, and then in terms of like timing and how long it takes, depending on how many employees we have, at which point during whenever we're at in time and space. But it can take a little while for the paperwork to ding back and forth a couple of times. And so just in general, like when folks are interested in like a high tunnel, for example, we encourage folks to reach out at least like 12 to 18 months ahead of when they're actually like wanting to get it in the ground, right? Because it's not instantaneous. We do have these batching periods that we have to keep to. And so hollering at us 12 to 18 months out is really what we're encouraging folks to do.
Yeah, and I would say that when you start to look at farm programs, we do have, for example, the WSDA infrastructure grant, and it's going to be opening up pretty soon, and there's a lot of people are going to apply, and there's kind of this frenzy around the application process. And then if you are funded, you have like a year to get it taken care of. And so it tends to be like a rushed process. And it may be something that you're applying for that, it might be something on your wish list or something that you're like, oh, well, they'll fund this, so I'm going to apply for it. I think the approach to take with any of the NRCS or the conservation district programs and practices is think about it as a strategic planning process what are the next steps to take my farm or my farm business to the next level? Do I want to have a season extension? And so maybe I want to start farming year round, or I want to be able to like sell at the farmer's market like Paulsbo that goes right into December and start at the really earliest. And so maybe a high tunnel or low tunnels or some of those practices make the most sense. Maybe I have those things, but I'd really like to work on soil health improvement. So let's start looking at some of the the soil amendment and the compost types of things. And so think about it as in the longer term context, not necessarily, that hurry up, hurry up, hurry up. Okay, so briefly,
I also just wanted to say, we talked about like a lot of different practices for a lot of different land uses tonight. And so a lot of times, when the planner, Aaron Oman, I saw his name in the chat here for Jefferson and Clallam counties. When you're working with your planner on this, conservation plan, this farm plan, right? We might be talking about, high tunnels and low tunnels and cover crop and crop rotation and mulching and micro irrigation and hedgerows and all these different things. And those can go into an overall plan, but then like as you're looking at, you know, what can you reasonably do in the next like 1 to 3 years, right? Because, you know, like Brian was mentioning, it took a little extra minute there because there was a hiccup with, the eligibility process with the farm name and stuff. And so there's always going to be a curveball, right? And so we encourage folks to like pick and choose what they think they can reasonably do in about 3 years without overwhelming themselves. If they have off-farm jobs, if they have kids, if they have whatever. And so, folks can come back and say, so this year I'm going to go for the high tunnels and the low tunnels. And then I think next year I'm going to come back and apply again for the cover crops and the crop rotation. Then the year after that, I'm going to come in for hedgerows, whatever it is. So it's not like you have to put everything in one basket, right? You can spread it out over a couple of years for yourself and, your sanity and whatever else you might be interested in that day. So.
yeah. So the other thing I might encourage people to do is think about like stacking practices. And so, for example, you might have a high tunnel, but you might at the same time do low tunnel because you want to be able to protect things that are in the low tunnel during the winter from bugs and any sorts of pests that might be arising in the spring. So there is some like stacking of practices that you can do, but that's where your planner becomes really important. Okay, so I'm going to put a plug in for the evaluation that you're going to receive via email and really encourage you to fill that out. And one of the things that we'll try and remember to do is also send out the link to Rebecca's, if you didn't catch it in the chat, to fill out Rebecca's producer survey. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing now because we have a whole bunch of questions in the chat. And so Anne has asked Brian, what was the total cost of your tunnel? And so that brings up the question. He says it was about 18,000. That brings up the question of reimbursement rate. Depending on what specifications you go for with your high tunnel, is it 100% reimbursement or is there a reimbursement cap? That would
You
be
want
a
me to
question for
respond to
Sean.
that?
Well, that would be a question for Sean or perhaps Rebecca.
Oh, sorry, it cut out there for a second. I heard reimbursement cap at the end of there.
Yeah, it's a
So,
per square foot. It was a per square foot dollar amount.
yeah. So, on a different matter, somebody had asked what to spec out a price on on a high tunnel, and so I went to Oregon Valley Greenhouse. They have a quote generator, and I just spec'd what I wanted, and it came to about $19,000. Are you able to reimburse 100% on that, or are there some reimbursement rates where the landowner may end up having to cost share it a little bit?
There are going to be reimbursement rates where the landowner or the client's going to have to eat some of the costs and everything, or search for additional partners to get additional funding. I will say for most of our high tunnel, or at least for the For the Gothic, for the wind and snow load rates and everything, for folks who are historically underserved, our payment rates there have been doing pretty good about getting pretty close to 100% coverage the last few years. But there are definitely other practices where payment rates on our end and everything aren't coming as close to what our percentages should be, where we might say we're doing 75%, but um, you spec it out and everything, you get an estimate, we might be ending up looking at closer to 50%. But there are other ones too, on the opposite end, of where our payment rates are much higher than the cost to implement and everything. And there are other aspects too, like with Brian's cost for the high tunnel. If he had contracted out the work to get that all in and everything, the cost there would be a good bit higher and everything. Um,
Yeah,
so
and
yeah.
Yeah,
Can I add
that's for
on?
sure.
Oh,
Yeah.
one of the things that's a
everybody
bit of an
wants.
uncertainty too is that materials cost can vary widely based on a variety of different things. We saw that happen during COVID, and we are also seeing some of that uncertainty with the tariff issue. And so NRCS really does the best that they can. They're perhaps not quite as nimble with changing reimbursement rates in response because they set those once a year. So that is something to consider. Brian, go ahead.
Yeah, fencing wise, I'm anticipating that if I would hire it out, if I would hire out the kind of fencing that I need, it wouldn't cover 50%. So therefore I'm gonna age considerably over the next couple of years because I'm gonna do all the fencing myself because I know how. I got experience doing it. Um, and then it's going to be pretty close to the cost of materials. Because I got a farm. I can't afford to pay a contractor to do that work. I don't know. I haven't penciled out any of the for heavy use area protection concrete work. I guess I haven't heard of any of the rates yet. I haven't penciled anything out, but that's something where I would struggle with because even though I can pour concrete, I can't pour at the scale that I would need to do it. So that's gonna be a little bit of a struggle. But if I can do the work myself, I'm definitely gonna do it myself because then I know it's I'm gonna be able to afford it.
I'll also
Yeah.
add on to that, if that's okay. And so, basically the way that our reimbursement rates work, it is a set rate reimbursement. And, like Brian mentioned, it's per square foot for high tunnels and low tunnels. It's per linear foot for fencing. It's per acre for prescribed grazing at cover crops. They have, small scale payment scenarios at per 1,000 square feet. They have per acre payment scenarios. And so, there's a lot of different options for the payment scenario selection. And then economists in DC basically take a look at the whole state of Washington and they say, okay, so let's say, just using easy numbers for high tunnels, in the state of Washington, on average, it costs $10 per square foot to install a Gothic high tunnel in Washington. So, for historically underserved farmers, like Sean mentioned before, we generally look at reimbursing somewhere between 75 and 90% of that $10 per square foot. And for non-historically underserved clients, we generally look at reimbursing somewhere between 50 and 75% of that $10 per square foot. And does it always work out as needed? No. And so at that point, that's when we go back to our national office and we say, this does not accurately reflect what it actually takes to install this practice in the state. And so that's where we look at shifting some of these payment scenarios and the payment rates. We do also generally see small increases every single year across all of our practices because of things like inflation. Um, but so there's some wiggle room within our different practices to kind of make a case for why we need to see something different in terms of the reimbursement rates. And then these reimbursement rates are also set for kind of like our minimum requirements for each practice, right? And so a lot of times we do have producers who are wanting to go above and beyond what these minimums are, and so it's going to cost more out of pocket for them, but we're going to reimburse that same set rate per, square footage that they install for a high tunnel, per linear footage that they install for a fence. And so you know, if folks are choosing to go above and beyond what the minimum requirements are for a practice, that's completely fine. We just ask that they like kind of clear it with us beforehand to make sure that the materials are still going to meet our requirements and that it's still going to be, you know, structurally sound, which usually it's like way more engineered. It's going to last, you know, 100 years, right? Rather than a 20-year fence, right? Um, so those are just some considerations in there. And also for things like high tunnels, you know, our reimbursement rate is spec'd out for the minimum requirements for a high tunnel. So, you know, if Brian, you know, he mentioned he kind of beefed it up with the double covering there that he could inflate to help protect the covering for longer in addition to getting that insulation benefit. He got the closer bows, right? And so that's also going to help the structural integrity, help it last for a lot longer. But those things do cost a little bit more money. And so we don't necessarily reimburse kind of on a basis of what you spent. It's more that set rate.
So one thing that came up is that there are some practices that are much shorter term. So like looking at the insect netting on the low hoops, for example, are those I know that there are some practices that you expect are a 5-year practice or a 10 or a 15-year, depending upon their durability. With something like the insect netting, is it a 1-year practice or is it a 2-year? How are you looking at, and is the insect netting included or just the hoops?
So for low tunnels specifically, that is currently a 1-year lifespan. And so a lot of times if folks are leasing land and they don't necessarily have a 5-year lease deal like we might see for high tunnels or something else where people are wanting to install something with a longer lifespan, that super works for folks. People can install low tunnels on community gardens, whatever it might be, right? So thank you for bringing that up, Diane.
Okay.
And so the reimbursement rate, it is supposed to include all the components of the practice, which would include the hoops, the covering, and also the way that it's anchored into the soil. And so, you know, whether you're getting just one covering of, you know, frost blanket in order to, you know, help your seedlings along in the early season, or whether you're getting 4 coverings, right? A frost blanket, an insect netting, a shade cloth, and a poly covering, we're going to reimburse at the same reimbursement rate, regardless of whether you got the 1 covering versus the 4 coverings, regardless of whether you have your low tunnel hoops at a 5-foot spacing or a 10-foot spacing. So that's where some considerations for the farmer come in as to what makes sense for them.
Okay. We also had talked a little bit about income requirements. And one of the things that I'm a huge advocate for is that when the minute you start your farming business, that you keep your receipts, you treat it like a business, and you file a Schedule F, because that is the federal tax form for farms, farm income, profit, and loss. If somebody hasn't been filing a Schedule F, say it's a community garden, do they still have to, say it's a nonprofit, it has a community garden, do they still have to provide that sort of income verification, or are there other forms of income verification that they can provide?
So, for something like a nonprofit, right, that would include all the members of the entity to go in and do eligibility. And so what we get folks to sign is basically a self-certification form saying, I make equal to or less than $900,000 a year averaged over the last 3 tax years. And then at that point, that gets sent off to the IRS with your either social security number or your EIN, and they do the checks up there.
Awesome. Are there any other questions? Oh, I did have a question. So Brian, you had said that you built the high tunnel yourself. Does that mean that you physically alone, all by yourself built it? Or did you have you and a couple of helpers and perhaps maybe Penny assist you with that process? Because I know sometimes people look at that and they think, wow, doing that by myself is really overwhelming. And I happen to know that you have a tractor that might make lifting the bows a little bit easier. So is there, based on your experience, are there some things that make it easier? And do you need any mechanization to do it?
Oh, you need, I guess I'm fortunate enough that, I built one of these just with a tractor, and I built a little boom or jib that I attached to the bucket. Um, and those, I always had help when I had a tractor and bucket. I had one other person that would help guide the hoops in place. But I'm fortunate enough to have an excavator on the farm, and I built a jig for that. And in that case, I did. I put half the hoops up myself, and then did a bunch of bracing myself. But if I had help available, I absolutely use help for the for the plastic. You better have five, 4, 5, 6 buddies. Doesn't have to be buddies, it can be male or female, but you need that many people to help put that up. Because there was another farmer on the island where um, after destroying two after two attempts at skinning their high tunnel and destroying their plastic, they called, and so the third attempt was actually successful, because they didn't have enough help, and they was doing it wrong. Windy days and skinning a greenhouse, really, really bad idea. Um, and yeah, but no, I had some help. I do have a question though, for Sean and Rebecca. Totally, it's not a different subject, but can a city or a county, if a city owns property and they get funded, if city owns a property, could they get funding for like a roof and cover?
So, as long as the applicant is still able to meet the program requirements, which a lot of times cities, counties, states, whatever, may own a piece of property, right? But they're probably gonna exceed the adjusted gross income limit of
Oh, yeah, yeah,
$900,000 a
yeah.
year
Yep,
averaged over
yep,
the last 3 years.
yep,
However, if they lease
yep.
it to a nonprofit, if they lease it to a community garden, if they lease it to an individual grower, that entity, that nonprofit is still able to put in an application with us, request assistance from us, as long as they're the ones controlling the piece of property for the
Yep.
lifespan of the contract.
Okay, yeah, that answers that. I should have known that.
We can't know everything, even though you seem like you do.
No,
You're
no,
a man of many
no,
talents.
no, no. Ask Diane. She knows all about my lack of talents.
Brian,
Diane spilled the tea.
Diane does know some of Brian's weaknesses, but he has such a wealth of knowledge and such a lot of experience. And I would say, Anne had asked about, how whether he put it up himself. Um, Brian is very gracious with his time, and he will come and provide you with technical assistance. And he might even help you just
Careful, Diane. Careful.
I know you, Brian. I know you. But no, I mean the technical assistant, so that he could come by and say, "Did I just see that? Behave yourself." And he would be able to he'd be able to provide you with the technical assistance to let you know you're going to need 5 or 6 people to skin a greenhouse, and just basically, talk you through what it would look like and how you would do it so that you don't shred a couple 3 layers of plastic. So, and several of us at the district have, experience. One of the people that we do have at the district that's a great resource is Dan Larson. He is a former NRCS planner with the US, with USDA, and he is more than willing to help people navigate the application process too. And so, if you have any questions, there is a number of people on staff at the district that can provide support and assistance. Right, Brian?
Yeah.
Are there any other questions? There has been a lot of stuff dropped in the chat about reimbursement rates and that sort of thing. And so we will probably be sending out that information later just to make sure that everybody got it. There was a question from Caitlin about deer fencing. And actually, when Rebecca and Sean visited a farm here in Kitsap the other day, Rebecca was talking about 3D fencing. So that might be an option that works for you, Caitlin. Perhaps maybe you could reach out to Rebecca just about that particular question. And I'm sure she'd be willing to like connect you with some resources on that.
I've been
Diane,
busy
she
popping
actually,
stuff in the chat too.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
oh, I was just saying that you dropped those resources in the chat, and I can, me or Diane will send those out in a follow-up email as well, so people can have access to those.
I appreciate it. Okay, we are at 8 o'clock. Are there any other questions? If you missed the link to the webinar evaluation that was in the chat, we'll be sending that out as well. We appreciate everybody who joined us. I made notes of what everybody's looking for, and we'll be connecting you with Sean and Rebecca to answer any questions that you might have. And we appreciate you. There it is again. We appreciate you joining us this evening.